Today we have another recap and rebuttals episode. We'll be summarizing the disputed issues from episodes 56 through 59. And we'll be looking at the time between Oswald's return from Mexico City and the day of the assassination. We have a great guest with encyclopedic knowledge of the JFK assassination, author and researcher Larry Hancock.
In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. The flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
I don't know what this is all about.
Dallas police this morning resumed custody the man they have formally charged with the assassination of President Kennedy.
I'm just a patsy.
The man is Lee Oswald.
Was Oswald acting alone, or was he a member of a conspiracy? Commission answers, he acted alone.
I'm working I'm just a patsy.
This is Solving JFK. I'm your host, Matt Crumpton. Today we're joined by author and researcher Larry Hancock. Larry is known as a document geek who is committed to only the most solid evidence, which I appreciate. Before he started writing his books on the JFK assassination, he researched and published several collections of CIA, FBI, and military documents. So his analysis is grounded in the documents, which, again, is a good thing. Larry is a board member of the Mary Farrell Foundation, a major online interactive history archive. Very useful if you're serious about researching the Kennedy assassination or other assassinations of the 60s. Larry has written 12 books, including books on the political assassinations of the 60s, like I was just saying, including Killing King, The Awful Grace of God, Someone Would Have Talked, and his most recent book, Tipping Point, The Conspiracy That Murdered President Kennedy. His upcoming book that will be out soon is called The Oswald Puzzle, Reconsidering Lee Harvey Oswald. Larry, welcome to Solving JFK. Thanks for joining us.
It's great to be with you, Matt. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Yeah, I'm sure we'll have a lot to cover here. I heard a UK Dealey Plaza talk, Larry, that you gave, which I thought was really well done. And one of the things that I liked the most about what you were saying is, you have to assess the evidence and rely on things that are in the record. And, I heard you mention that, you've maybe fallen out of favor with certain folks on the Warren Report critic or conspiracy side, because, there's certain claims that are popular on the critic side that you don't support. And I've also frequently seen you mentioned by Warren Report defenders as, hey, he's the most reasonable guy on the conspiracy side that we can talk to. So that probably sullies your reputation with Warren Report critics. But so my point is, you're not married to narratives and you follow the facts. And that's what we try to do on this podcast. Not always successful, but we try to do. So up front, I wanted to say thank you for that.
I appreciate it. And I think the other thing I always commented, I think it's very important to say, if it's speculative, to say you're speculating. It's like, it's great to have opinions. It's great to make speculation, but you need to call out the speculation and separate it from the factual material.
Right. Especially when there's enough factual material. I mean, we haven't gotten into it yet, but in my view, there's enough rock solid factual evidence to demonstrate that the Warren Report was incorrect. So
no question about that. That's kind of the starting point. You've got that already. I think we spent decades establishing that point.
Right. At the end of each topical series here on the podcast, we do a recap and rebuttals summary to talk through the disputed topics in those episodes. I'm not going to cover every single thing that was in the episodes because that's in the episodes. But today is the 13th recap and rebuttals. And we're covering the time from Oswald's return to Mexico until the day of the assassination. So before we start that, I kind of want to look backwards for just one question, because I thought I knew what I believed. And then I spoke to Dr. John Newman. He's got a very different perspective. And my question for you, Larry, is do you believe that Oswald, that the actual Lee Harvey Oswald, went to Mexico City? Do you believe that if he did go there, was he impersonated, or did the actual Oswald never go there?
Yeah, I was kind of forced back into that and spent about 3 or 4 months specifically on Mexico City recently as we were doing the Oswald puzzle. And I think my assessment at this point is that Oswald going to Mexico City is very consistent with his agendas at that point in time that had begun that summer. There's a lot of continuity in it. So I find it very credible that Oswald was in Mexico City personally, although there are lots of open questions about his travel. But I will also assess, and I assess in the book, that he was impersonated. So to answer your question, yes, Oswald in Mexico City, yes, he was impersonated, and we go into link that at presenting why we think both were true.
Okay. Yeah, that's precisely what Dr. Newman said as well. And then the whole Sylvia Odio incident and all those folks, do you think that's an intentional impersonation of Oswald? Because the real Oswald would be in Texas then? I mean, would be in Mexico City then?
The timing on that's very unclear to me.
Okay.
In all honesty, I've looked at it over the years. I honestly don't think there's anything that excludes the real Oswald being in Dallas and later in Mexico City. Uh,
Okay.
I find the Odio incident could very well involve the real Oswald. In fact, I suspect it did, and for good reason, because it was necessary to point Oswald in a certain direction. So yeah, I can accept in both places just because of the issues with the timing.
Understood. Okay. All right, and that was a bonus. We weren't supposed to cover that, but there you go. All right, let's start with the recaps here. Episode 56. We just covered, Oswald back in Dallas. What are some of the basics of what he's doing when he comes back to Dallas, assuming assuming he did go to Mexico City. The first issue is, did Ruth Paine try to set up Oswald by getting him a job at the Texas School Book Depository? This is the big allegation. So let's just kind of walk through the facts really fast. Marina was talking with Ruth Paine and her neighbors, Dorothy Roberts and Lenny Mae Randall. These four mothers of young children were talking about Lee's difficulty in finding a job. Then they started to brainstorm places where he could potentially apply. Lenny Mae Randall says that they discussed Manor Bakeries and Texas Gypsum. And Randall also mentioned that her brother, Buell Wesley Frazier, was hired at the depository recently and that he was staying very busy. She did not say anything about a job being open there. Ruth Paine then asked Lenny to call the book depository to try to get Oswald a job. Lenny said no because she didn't know anyone there and she didn't know if there were any openings. Ruth then takes it upon herself to call the book depository, and she talks to Supervisor Roy Truly, telling him that Oswald needs a job as he's about to have another child. Ruth talked to Oswald on the phone that night when Marina called him, and she let him know, hey, got you this job at the book depository, show up there tomorrow. And Oswald did. He was hired the next day. So on one hand, it looks like Ruth is, just trying to help Lee get a job. But on the other hand, she does seem a little pushy about having Lenny Mae Randall make the call. Maybe that's nothing. And she ignored the other two options that were brought up. Ruth didn't check in with Texas Gypsum or Baker Manories, but you could argue that, maybe she just wanted to see if Oswald could get the job there because at the depository because of Frazier, and maybe it would be more convenient, etc. Then we have the Trans-Texas Airlines job. On Oswald's first day of work at the book depository, a man named Robert Adams from the Texas Employment Commission called the Paine home and asked to speak to Oswald. Adams was offering a job as a baggage handler with the Trans-Texas Airlines that paid 30% more than Oswald's book depository job and was a permanent job, unlike the seasonal book depository gig. This information about this Trans-Texas Airlines job was apparently never passed on to Oswald, even though he was looking for a higher paying job, according to Marina. Ruth never told him about this higher paying job at Trans-Texas Air. Ruth Paine told the Warren Commission that Oswald told her about the job. But that's not possible according to Adams' affidavit, because he says the only time he communicated anything about this job was when he called the Paine home and he spoke to someone there who said Oswald had already taken another job. So my conclusion on this, and then Larry, I'd love to hear your thoughts, would be that, the fact that Ruth Paine called the depository about a job for Oswald, that's not necessarily that big of an issue. I mean, yes, you could say it looks bad, in terms of her setting him up or whatever, but you could also argue that she's just trying to help. But I do think it is suspicious that she did not tell Oswald about the better paying job at Trans-Texas Airlines, especially when he was looking for a better paying job. And the biggest thing to me that makes this whole thing cloudy is the fact that Lenny Mae Randall is the first one to bring up the depository. And no one's really saying that Lenny Mae Randall is involved, but maybe she was going to bring it up anyway because of her brother. For me, I think it's inconclusive. It maybe leans a little suspicious, but what are your thoughts, Larry?
Yeah, I think one thing that you mentioned that we have to keep in mind is that Ruth Paine was an assertive person. There's just no doubt about that. She had been involved with Marina for months at that point in time. She'd even made, when Marina expressed to her the fact that, Lee kept getting in trouble with Lee, Ruth always took Marina's side and she was always trying to help Marina. So the thought of her following up on somebody down the street on a job, calling to get Lee handled, quite frankly, we don't want him hanging around the house. We've got babies. We've got little kids. We need him gone, is probably a real priority for her. And it obviously made Marina more comfortable. So I don't find that part suspicious, especially since, this guy's down the street. He can drive Lee back and forth to work if necessary, and it's a local connection. So I find that credible enough. As far as reaching back to Oswald and informing him about a better job, who knows? You've got a house full of kids, you got a new baby on the way. Did she forget? Whatever. Maybe she told Marina and Marina didn't mention it to Oswald. That's just an open question. I think it is important to remember, though, that Oswald himself stayed in touch with the Employment Commission, and Oswald continued to look for new jobs after he got the school book depository job. So how or whether he might have heard about that, we actually, after the assassination, local reporters determined that Oswald even applied for a job well after he had the school book depository job. So again, what he did, what he didn't do. But to answer your question, I don't find Ruth's trying to get him a job particularly suspicious, especially, with someone who lived in the same block that could be of assistance at times, because Oswald did come and go. There's no doubt about that, as we know from Frazier.
Sure. Okay, good. Well, let's move on to the next issue. Can we learn anything from the Oswald letter to a Mr. Hunt? Okay, so this is the story of this, mysterious letter that shows up. Penn Jones receives the letter from an unknown contact in Mexico City. So the provenance of this whole thing sounds a little bit iffy to me, okay? But what the letter says is it's a letter dated November 8th, 1963. There are 3 handwriting experts that I saw in a New York Times article said that there were 3 handwriting experts that confirmed that this was Oswald's handwriting. I don't know any more details about who the handwriting experts were, but what the letter said, short and sweet, it said, "Dear Mr. Hunt, I would like information concerning my position. I am asking only for information. I am suggesting that we discuss the matters fully before any steps are taken by me or anyone else. Thank you, Lee Harvey Oswald." Now, people have speculated that Mr. Hunt could be H.L. Hunt or it could be E. Howard Hunt. I have no idea whatsoever. This is completely inconclusive to me, but I didn't know if you had any thoughts on this saga.
I do, and I've talked to several people who've researched it further, and I think a couple of things that are important is the letter was sent during the operation of the HSCA. We know from other sources that the Soviets felt that that was really an opportunity to make the CIA look bad, in particular with Howard Hunt having been in the press for like 2 years before this letter arrives. It arrived sent from Mexico City. In a separate book that I've written, Creative Chaos, I've studied Soviet disinformation campaigns. They were expert at signature forgeries, and one of their most common activities around the world was to create these sort of things and add them to the mix to make the CIA look bad, to make the State Department look bad. I think to kind of sum it up, Mary Farrell and I discussed this one time, and she said she'd actually had some people look into the address that was on the envelope in Mexico City. That was a storefront, not a real location. The address, however, is 2 blocks from the Soviet embassy. So my take is probably that this was indeed a piece of minor Soviet disinformation that didn't accomplish anything, but sounds really good. Like, we're going to make the CIA look bad with this guy.
Yeah. And even the thing is, even if it was something, there's just no thread to follow. There's nothing there for us to be able to tell one way or the other. So yeah, that's very interesting that the address was traced back to a couple blocks away from the Soviet embassy. Wow. Okay. Let's move on to the third issue. Episode 56 is packed with issues. All right. So just touching on the story of the morning when Oswald's leaving, the morning of the assassination, before he goes and gets a ride with Fraser. I want to just talk about that little saga. So on the night before the assassination, Oswald stays at the Paine home, which is not normal for him to do on a Thursday night. He and Marina had been fighting, and Marina says that she thought he came over early, on Thursday instead of coming on his normal Friday, because he was trying to patch things up. And he did tell her that he was planning on not coming over Friday, but then coming back Saturday. So he didn't say that he was going to be gone forever. But anyway, Oswald left $170 in a wallet for Marina when he left for work that morning. And a lot of people say that, look, this is him leaving all his money for her. And it's evidence that, he kind of knew what he was going to do. But that wallet, if we look at Marina's testimony, it seems like it acted more like a bank. Like, he would take what he needed, then he would leave the remainder in the wallet. So I think that is not a big deal. But the part that I can't explain, that, I think potentially may be a good point, is the wedding ring, right? So, assuming Marina's telling the truth, which is always a question mark, she says that he left his wedding ring there, and, that was never something that he had done as far as she knew. So your thoughts on those topics, Larry?
I think it is important. I think it may be indicative that there was something on Oswald's mind. As a matter of fact, in the new book, we spend a lot of time assessing the fact that about half of the book is devoted to our speculation that Oswald was planning something special that day, that Oswald had been at kind of a personal tipping point. He had 2 agendas that were running, one with getting back with Marina, which he was seriously trying to do, and another agenda which was pointing towards Cuba. This had nothing to do with the Kennedy assassination. My comment on this is I think he very well may have been distracted that day. He may have had mixed emotions. He may have simply forgotten the ring. I think there was a lot on his mind, and he was going a different direction. I think the exchange with Marina had kind of persuaded him which direction to go, but it had nothing to do with shooting the president.
Wow. Okay. Well, we'll have to get that book to find out more. And by the way, when is the new book out?
It's should out in January. Should
Okay.
definitely be out by mid-January. It's up on Amazon now for pre-order.
Perfect. Okay. Sounds good. All right. Let's go to issue number 4. We're flying through them here. This is very efficient, Larry. Good stuff. another fun one with the Paines. Did the Paines really make an incriminating phone call on the day of the assassination? Okay. So on November 26th, Captain Paul Barger advised the FBI that, quote, he had received information that a male voice was overheard in a conversation which took place between the Paine residence and Michael Paine's employer, Bell Helicopter. The informant advised that the male voice was heard to comment that he felt sure Lee Harvey Oswald had killed the president, but did not feel that Oswald was responsible, and further stated, quote, We both know who is responsible. Dun, dun, dun. um, on January 17th, so this is after November 26th, this is the first statement from Paul Barger. Okay. Then a couple months later, January 17th, Barger changed his story to say that he had been assigned to, quote, obtain a list of telephone tickets or other helpful information from the Southwestern States Telephone Company, and that he felt sure that the information he previously furnished to the FBI had come from some telephone company sources, but he was still unable to identify the individual who had related that information to him. This time, Barger also updated his story to include that, quote, the only guilty bastard was Oswald, as far as what the person heard on the phone and told him, which is a very different story from we both know who is responsible. And Oswald wasn't responsible.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a totally substantively different story. And then finally, in 1976, Barger tells journalist Hugh Ainsworth that a telephone repairman had overheard the call. If we listen to his later statements, he basically says, my bad, nothing happened. I mean, we're talking about Barger here. But I don't understand how Barger could have gotten the story wrong initially and have the phone numbers included when the story's wrong, right? That's very specific information to come across. You know, I'd want to know who gave him those numbers that happened to be the same numbers as the Paine home and Bell Helicopter. And also the story that Barger tells Ainsworth, if it's just a random repairman who overheard the call, I mean, how does that work? He's working on a wire and maybe he hears the call. How's he going to know what the numbers are? I mean, I don't know enough about the details of the technology there, but so to me, this is definitely not reliable, but I also wouldn't throw it out because I just would need more information. But what do you know about this, Larry?
Well, maybe I can help with a little of the detail there, having worked in the telephone industry with installer, repairman, switching equipment. So let's start in the beginning. There's not going to be a repairman working that on the phone unless there's a problem with the phone line. That just doesn't happen. I mean, you just don't go out and put your butt in set on a random line and start listening to it. That doesn't happen. And even if he were doing that, he would not hear any dial digits. You know, you can hear dial digits if it's the old pulse code type digit, but a repairmen are not going to be counting those digits down to determine the telephone number. And so the fact that the repairman he might have known the telephone number for a calling phone, he would not have known the destination of the call. And it makes the repairman part makes no sense anyway. Okay. If there were a telephone tap on that line for other purposes, it would be something totally different, but not an installer repairman. Second, the only way that you're going to capture both the call number and the calling number is if that call had been a local call out over a toll switch, and unless she was making a long distance call. If it was, then the numbers are going to be captured for billing purposes, and the telephone company would have a record of the call with both the call number and the calling number. So could you come up with that off a long distance call on a bill? Yeah, but it would tell you nothing about who said what. You know, that's generated by a machine. The third option is Michael Paine's telephone number was probably sitting behind what's called a PABX. People at those companies did not have individual telephone lines. They're not in hundreds of it goes to central local switch and then is extended to another call. Again, that would not have captured any telephone numbers. You wouldn't have known who the caller was, and there's no specific number for Michael Paine. But somebody could have heard the telephone call. So it's like three sets of information, all of which are exclusive, none of make any sense together. You know, there's just somebody could hear, you know, maybe they transferred the call to Michael Paine and for some reason stayed on the line or had it on their desk open and heard it. But none of this really makes much sense. It really doesn't. And involving Hugh Ainsworth, who is one of the most skeptical sources on anything regarding to events in Dallas, makes it even worse. Because if Ainsworth said it, you can't trust it. So bottom line, none of that makes any sense other than the fact that there might have been a telephone record that showed a long distance call from Ruth's home to Michael Paine's work location. So maybe somebody could have dug those numbers out of the record, but that gives you no content of the call.
So is it inconclusive, or are you saying based on what you're hearing, you would toss it out?
I'd toss it out.
Okay.
I think
What
it's
do, what
just
do you think?
another one. Yeah.
What do you think Barger? Why do you think he just fabricated it, or did like? I'm
I
just
don't know why Barger would say such strange. The first thing about Barger is it sounds like he's trying to incriminate Oswald by saying Oswald didn't shoot the president, but he's at fault. It really sounds like he doesn't have anything to offer other than he's trying to implicate Oswald for whatever reason.
Huh.
That the first statement he gives is totally inconsistent. Like, well, Oswald didn't do it, but he's guilty. Okay, yeah, right. So I I don't know. I'm suspicious. There were definitely people that tried to point towards Oswald for certain reasons. We absolutely know that there were people that tried to link Oswald to different sponsors because they had their own agendas. And to some extent, that's what it sounds like to me.
Okay. All right. Let's move on to number 5. What are we to make of Ruth Paine saying, "We've been expecting you," when the police showed up on the day of the assassination? So we have confirmation from Gus Rose and Buddy Walthers. They both told, I believe, the Warren Commission in their Warren Commission testimony that Ruth made this statement, "We've been expecting you," right when they showed up, which was at a time when she knew the president had been shot and knew that it was probably from the book depository. It was in Dealey Plaza, but she had no information implicating Oswald. It was before Oswald had been announced as a suspect. So Michael Paine also shows up at the Paine home, even though he's separated and he lives somewhere else at the time, before Oswald's announced as the suspect. And he says, quote, "I came to help you. Just as soon as I heard where it happened, I knew you would need some help." So it's pretty weird that both Ruth and Michael just jump to the conclusion that Oswald did it when they find out that the shots could have come from the school book depository. I mean, maybe it's not weird. I guess you could say, well, no, they said, oh, well, he's a ne'er-do-well, but man, that's a large conclusion to jump to, especially since neither of them realized he had the gun, if he did, in the garage. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things in play. One of the things that is a bit confusing is even though Ruth and Michael were separated, apparently they talked fairly frequently, which makes the fact that Ruth might have called Michael, but then again, if Ruth called Michael, why didn't he say that? It's kind of like, we just talked and I'm worried. So that kind of speaks back to that fact that that other call maybe didn't happen because he just shows up. I know you need help, but maybe they did call. Okay. But Ruth and Michael did talk. Michael did visit. The other thing that was happening that both Ruth and Marina described in particular, Oswald was calling Marina daily at the Paines because of the baby. And she makes this very clear. He was concerned about the baby, how things were going. So he would routinely call her at his lunch hour. She was expecting a call from Oswald. He didn't call. So we've got the fact that there was an expected call from Oswald. He didn't call. Everybody knows he's working at the school depository. And everybody knows, as Oswald himself knew, that he would be picked up by the police because he's been in Russia. Oswald's remark that, I'm a patsy, they've got me because I've been in Russia. There are lots of reasons for anybody that knew Oswald to think he was going to be a suspect. So I'm not sure that helps me with that remark. I'm not comfortable with the remark, but I'm also comfortable with the fact that with them expecting a call from Oswald as he usually did, that not happening, and he's working at the school depository. Are they going to suspect him? That's a possible explanation. That's the best I can offer.
The part about Marina expecting a phone call and not getting it is definitely that makes sense to me. Where do we get that from? Is that from her Warren Commission testimony?
Yeah, we get it from Marina herself, saying
Okay.
that he was routinely calling her on his breaks, on it. Yeah, because he was very concerned about the baby.
And at this point, it's getting past the point of when he would have called. So it's like, oh, he didn't call, and this happened. All right. Well, yeah. Well, they should have said that. Ruth should have mentioned that.
He didn't
But
call. Yeah, so that's one of our problems. If everybody had said what we hoped they should have
yeah,
said,
right.
we would be much better off, right?
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So, all right, let's go on to the next one. Buddy Walthers. So here's a cool story. Buddy Walthers' grandson hit me up, and he sent me a bunch of documents that Buddy had. I guess Buddy had become friends with Jack Ruby in his last couple years, and he got all these. He sent me the document of, and maybe I'm sure it already exists somewhere, but it's all of the doctors who visited Jack Ruby in their sign-in sheet, in like his whatever two
Oh, I
years
remember.
maybe.
Yes.
And of course Jolly West is on there like
Yes.
4 times, that's fun. That's a good time. All right, for topic for another day. Anyway, shout out to Blake for reaching out. Would love to get him on the show and talk about his family stuff sometime. All right, number 6. Did Buddy Walthers really find filing cabinets that were full of Cuban sympathizers at the Paine home? So the story is that, Walthers, when he shows up there after the assassination to kind of do a search, he comes across these Cuban sympathizer files, right? Which, it's like, why would he have those? Is Michael Paine, or are the Paines like intelligence agents of some sort? That's sort of the implication here. So let's look at this issue. The Warren Commission brought this question up about, whether Walthers actually found filing cabinets full of Cuban sympathizers. And Walthers pretty much denied seeing them to the Warren Commission. He didn't deny it. He said, I don't remember. I didn't look inside. He said, I still don't know to this day. That's what he said. But the thing is that this idea of the Cuban sympathizers didn't just come out of thin air. It's not like it was from, some tabloid. It's from Walthers' written statement on the day of the assassination. Quote, also found was a set of metal file cabinets containing records that appeared to be names and activities of Cuban sympathizers. So if you choose not to believe this written statement, you have to answer why Walthers would write that. All right. And, did he just think it would be fun to guess what was in the folders that he told the Warren Commission he never saw, or what? And it's the first thing that Walthers ever wrote about the topic. It's not like he changed his position later. This is his first statement. There's also potentially related. There's also an FBI report from Ed Buck and Betty Mann about seeing Michael Paine at Luby's restaurant, and Paine approached them and started talking about Cuba. Then he sort of weasels his way into sitting with them as they eat. And he told them that he liked to talk politics with students at the Southern Methodist University. And of course, the first thing he brings up when he's talking to them is Cuba. Now, the counterpoint here is that Michael Paine was just very talkative, and he was eccentric, and he liked to meet new people, and he loved talking about politics.
Yeah.
But when we combine Walthers' original first day written statement with all of Michael Paine's activities, it really makes you wonder if Walthers' statement wasn't true. What are your thoughts on that, Larry?
Yeah, I wrestle with this at length all the way back when I was writing Someone Would Have Talked. And I spent a lot of time on Walthers, and not just this, but his Harlandale report and everything related to Walthers. The first thing that struck me is how he would have known that these were Cuban sympathizers. If I just open up a file cabinet and see a bunch of names, it's like, how would he know that they were names of Cuban sympathizers other than, other people? Okay, so that was a question I could never answer for myself. We do know that there was a lot of Cuban material that was collected at that point in time. It was Oswald's material, pamphlets, books, letters, correspondence with the Fair Play for Cuba. A lot of, I'm actually surprised that nobody wrote that up. There's no officer that said, oh, we picked up all of this material, because that would be similar. That makes it look like, and I mean, let's face it, Oswald was a Cuban sympathizer, right? Okay, so who Michael had talked with a lot about Cuba. So again, the problem is we know that a lot of Cuba-related material was picked up by the police, and it's not mentioned specifically, okay, in anybody's report. Yet we set that aside by Walthers, a filing cabinets full of names. Okay, I can't reconcile that. What I can say is that what we have in evidence, and it's online now. You can look at it. There are 144 pages of materials collected from Oswald materials, personal possessions, that were stored in some fashion. Nobody said, everybody wrote down how they were stored. They're just collected, and the Dallas police laid them out and photographed them. So a ton of material relating to Cuba is there. Did Walthers get confused? This is Cuba sympathizer material. It's just not a file cabinet full of names. I don't know. I don't know if he misspoke, if he got confused, but that's what we do have in evidence versus the file cabinet that seems to go away, and one of the questions is, did they actually collect the whole file cabinet, or did they just pull stuff out of the file cabinet? I don't know. There's certainly no file cabinet in evidence, and there's no sign of organized material. There are no file folders.
Right.
What there are photo albums that they collected that are full of photos. So I loved it. It's one of those great mysteries that you love, and it was great to write about, and I can't reconcile it. There's just no factual evidence to show that existed, that it was either the Paines or Oswald's. They weren't supposed to be collecting the Paines materials. I also find, and we'll get into it, I'm sure, what Ruth and Michael were doing and who they were talking to and the information they were collecting. Whatever Michael was doing, talking politics, whether he was collecting information and storing it, it doesn't seem like it would have been in the garage with Oswald's possessions. Would be some, this is a file cabinet. If this is something I'm doing, it's just, I don't keep it in the garage. That kind of doesn't make much sense if somebody's doing intelligence collection and they're keeping a file cabinet in the garage. Yeah. I mean, right now I have file cabinets in my garage, but that's a totally different story.
Right.
So it just doesn't make sense to me, Matt. The best I can take is that Walthers did collect a lot of Cuba related materials, support materials, and that's what his remark was about. The file cabinet thing just totally eludes me.
Okay. All right. Let's get on then to sort of the big question when it comes to Ruth and Michael Paine. I love how we always say Ruth first, but hey, that's she's the star. So bottom line on the Paines, were Ruth or Michael Paine intelligence assets of some sort? Okay, so just to recap the basics, and again, there's way more details. This is a hotly disputed issue. I'll just say out of the gate, like, there are people who get really, really, really upset at me for even saying that these are the arguments. People are mad that I'm even saying these are the arguments. I'm not even saying, necessarily that I agree with all these arguments. I'm just saying, here's the argument. How dare you tell people that that's the argument? It's like, well, I don't know. It's just a big historical event. So anyway, all right. First of all, if you want to hear more on the Paines, episode 57, we go in depth on the Paines. Okay, touching on the highlights, though. Ruth, what I would label aggressively pursued a relationship with Marina. As soon as she meets her, she asks her to move in with her child after only seeing her 5 times total. You could view this either as the pursuit of friendship and altruism, or Ruth kind of being on a mission. And maybe Ruth was on a mission to have friends, right? You could argue that too. Ruth and Michael both have a lot of intelligence connections and other sort of interesting connections. Of course, the most famous one that people talk about is Alan Dulles' mistress, one-time mistress, Mary Bancroft, being Michael's mom's best friend. And Ruth Paine's dad and her brother-in-law were working for the USAID, which at the time was a CIA cutout, according to a number of folks, including the person I believe who was the director. I have to go back and look at my citations for that. And her sister, Ruth Paine's sister, was a W-2 employee of the CIA. There's another tie. The one that to me is the most interesting is Frederick Osborne Jr., who is a Warren Commission character witness for the Paines. His dad, Frederick Osborne Sr., was one of Alan Dulles' closest friends at Princeton, who, him and Dulles corresponded afterwards, right? So I'm not saying they corresponded on this issue necessarily, but they continued to be friends. So these mere connections, and this is the whole conspiracy theory board and the crazy guy with like the yarn and this, all the stuff going places. Mere connections do not prove action, okay? But they do show that, potentially opportunity, I suppose, right? But there are a lot of connections there. Okay, then we also have all the evidence that originated from the Paine garage and the Paine house. But the thing is, so you could say, hey, as soon as Ruth got Marina to move in, then she could have Oswald store his stuff there. Then it's just the magical bag of evidence, and they just keep finding stuff out of Oswald's bag that they could put there. That's true. That's a legitimate argument, but it's also true that if Oswald did all these things, and if Marina was staying there in good faith, then the evidence would be there. So that's true too. One thing I think is a little more on the suspicious side is Michael Paine being the first person on the record to mention that Oswald was potentially involved in the General Walker shooting. This is the day after the assassination in the Houston Post. I didn't believe it. I was able to actually get a copy of this paper, and sure enough, he really was the first person to bring it up. And then we also have the claims from the Garrison investigation that Jim Garrison tried to get the tax returns of Ruth Paine and Michael Paine, and were told that they were classified and he could not subpoena them. And Marina was told by Secret Service agents to not hang out with Ruth Paine because she was affiliated with the CIA. I don't know how rock solid those are, but if those statements are true, that's pretty strong. Actually, I'll toss to you first, and then I'll come back with mine. What do you think, Larry?
Yeah, I think a couple of things, and it really helps to parse this out if you look at the way the intelligence agencies operated. People paint with broad brushes, but if you look at, you really understand the CIA, how it operated, the difference between its operations and its domestic operations, and compare that with the CIA, to kind of cut to the chase. It makes perfect sense that Ruth, in particular, would have been a source for the FBI, not the CIA, okay? Because you have to look at what Ruth is doing. She is giving language lessons. Her specialty is Russian language. She's talking to people within the white Russian community. So because of her language interest, she's in contact with a lot of people. Normally it would be anti-Soviet Union because this is the white Russian community, but the FBI collects information on both sides. They love files on everybody because we're going to categorize them. This person isn't suspect. This person is suspect. What this is, so the thought of Ruth being a source for the FBI makes some sense. Actually, even the fact that Ruth was obviously very cooperative with the FBI after the fact makes some sense. The fact that Ruth and Michael were active with the ACLU, who the FBI did not like at all. There are lots of things in their personal lives that they're doing that would have made them good sources for the FBI, not the CIA. This is, the FBI, who they're talking to in Dallas and who is saying what in Dallas is the primary mission of the Dallas FBI office. Okay. So we also have to parse out the fact that, she was, as I say, she was cooperative after the assassination. So does that suggest that she might have been a source before the assassination? Well, there's a very interesting remark that I mentioned someone would have talked, where there's a memo that actually from J. Edgar Hoover that says we mustn't let the Paines take us down the same road that we went with Jack Ruby. Now, Jack Ruby was actually a provisional criminal informant for the FBI for almost 2 years. And whether or not they actually used him in court remains suspicious, because they did win a case where he would have had information. And all that testimony is offered in secret. They were using him, they provided him with equipment, and then all of a sudden they're not using him because he's no longer of any value. And when you get into their explanation of why they're not using them, it doesn't make much sense. But the fact that Hoover would even be concerned that the fact that they would have the Paines in the same committee, maybe not as sources. There's a big difference between sources and provisional informants. All the offices were tasked with maintaining a source list and a potential informant list. But to get on the potential informant list, you actually had to be able to provide information about a subversive organization or about a crime. That rolled you up onto the list and you got handled in a special way. But you could be a source if you just made yourself available to answer questions routinely. If you heard anything of interest or whatever, and we have no idea because we don't have the big piece that's missing out of the Dallas office is the subversive files. We do not have the subversive files, including the files for Walter Heitman, who is running that part of the desk. So we can't know if the Paines were or were not actual sources for the FBI. I would say that Hoover's remark has convinced me that they very well may have been. So that would be where I come down on them as having some sort of intelligence connection, much more to the FBI than the CIA.
Okay, and everything you said makes sense. But so if they were merely FBI informants, what was the word you used?
Sources.
FBI sources. Then yeah, sure, you could technically check the yes, they're intelligence agents box. But I think a lot of people, especially on the Warner Report critic side, take the view that, oh, look, the Everett Glover party, that's the magic handoff from George de Mohrenschildt to Ruth Paine. And now Ruth Paine's the handler, and that's why she's chasing Marina down, and that's, so aggressively. And so I think the allegation is that she knew something was either she knew something was going on, or she knew that her mission was to get Marina to live with her or something. I mean, but there's no. How would you view a claim like that? I guess
I think her letters explain that to us. She wasn't really interested in Oswald. She was interested in Marina. Just because they were both women who had young children who were separated from their husband. There was a lot to identify between the two. Ruth needed somebody to talk to, being separated from Michael. But most importantly, as you look at Ruth's visit to the Oswalds in New Orleans, and at that point in time, a series of correspondence occurs after that, because Oswald, since January of 1963, has been trying to get Marina back to Russia. Marina is trying to get back to Russia. Ruth writes, and once they've been to New Orleans and things, Ruth's been in New Orleans, she's seen them, and things are starting to go bad again. And Oswald is pushing to get Marina back to Russia. She writes an interesting letter, and the letter says, well, if he don't feel pressured by him, don't feel that you have to leave and go back to Russia. Don't feel like, you can come live with me. I will actually, room and board is free. I will actually arrange for you to receive, you can tutor me in Russian. I need to learn when it's all about Marina. None of it is about Oswald. It's written as if Oswald's out of the picture. So again, is there an intelligence connection to Ruth babysitting Marina? Not Oswald. I can't say it's not, but to me, it sounds very personal. It does not sound like this is a mission tasking.
And on the Marina side of things, there's a CIA document that's, 29 reasons why Marina might be KGB. I mean, I guess that if Ruth was FBI, perhaps she was just watching Marina. I know we don't have a document for that, but that becomes a little more. If you want to get into what is there evidence for that doesn't just look suspicious, that it might be down that road of like, hey, the FBI was having Ruth keep tabs on Marina because they thought she could have been KGB based on this document from the CIA that says 29 reasons Marina's KGB.
The commentary on that is that interestingly enough, when the FBI first interviewed Oswald, the paperwork shows that they were concerned about both Oswald and Marina's potential contacts with communists, and they cleared both of them. It wasn't that they just cleared Oswald, they cleared both of them. The other thing is, we know from Hosty, when the Oswalds were back in Dallas, his concern was about Marina. It's quite interesting. So if he represented the FBI, it would be a concern about who Marina was talking to, all of which is kind of strange. It's sort of like, what can this young woman with 2 children or 1 child and pregnant do as an intelligence? Like, is she really a spy? And what's she going to tell anybody about anything? But it's the mindset that she could have had connections. But yeah, there's a lot to argue that there was more FBI focus, in particular, on Marina than Lee.
Okay. And then just before we leave the Paines, sort of, are they suspicious question, you've spoken in terms of actual evidence that we have, what you can be sure of. So would you agree that when we lay all these things together on top of each other, aside from the actual evidence we have, just the things that we've mentioned, it doesn't look great. I mean, you can make an argument that it doesn't look great, but you could also make an argument that it's not a big deal. Is that, I mean, how would you land on that?
The argument I would make, since we can't see the files, right? We can't see the argument I would make is that the FBI would not have been doing their job if they had not been interested in Marina and Lee, and that the fact that they might well have used and remained in contact with Ruth, who meets the profile of the source on Russian activities in Dallas, Fort Worth. That just suggests to me that they would be doing their job, which is a place that I always come down on. I'm not suspicious when an intelligence agency appears to be doing their job. That's what they're supposed to be doing.
Sure.
I mean, we might not like it, but it doesn't, their day job is what it is. So I would come down on the side that there very well could have been a connection to the Paines. I would just tend to point it towards the FBI, not the CIA. And to some extent, the fascinating thing is, if they checked Ruth and Michael out as a potential source, they would have looked at the same connections that you just described earlier. Like, okay, these are credible people. They're reliable people. They're on our side. Okay, we can use it.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we'll tie a bow on the Paines there. All right. Let's move on to Oswald impersonations in the fall of 1963. Okay. So, and then I have a rebuttal that's in here. Rebuttal number 1 we'll get to. In episode 58, we talk about all the instances of people seeing Lee Harvey Oswald at times and places where Oswald is already accounted for. But these can't just be cases of mistaken identity in most of them, because the witnesses report some additional fact that is consistent with this person being Oswald. Like, he looked just like Oswald, and he said that he served in the Marines, and he had a wife that spoke Russian, and he said he had just returned from Mexico, and all these other facts. So, again, we're not going to cover all of those claims, but just in terms of a grouping of claims, there are 12 people who claim to have seen Oswald and Ruby together. Now, here's rebuttal number 1 on this topic. So this is from James, and James says, quote, "This concerns the various sightings of Jack Ruby with someone resembling Oswald. The name Oswald was used in only 1, if not 2 of these instances cited in your podcast, if I recall correctly. The possibility, if not likelihood, that Ruby's close companion and barman, Larry Crayford, was mistaken for Oswald in many of these instances is highly relevant. In her March 20th, 1964 Warren Commission testimony, Ruth Paine notes a resemblance between the two men, especially in the face, stronger in some photos she was shown than in others. Clearly, Assistant Counsel Albert Jenner had an agenda of attributing sightings of Ruby with Oswald to mistakes involving Crayford. Admittedly, the Crayford photos in CE 453-6, volume 17, that were shown to Paine do not suggest a particularly strong resemblance. Okay, thank you. That's a good rebuttal, James. I went back and looked at this, and it is true that most of these sightings that I mentioned were just identifications of Oswald. So everything I just said about, there's Oswald, someone saying the person looked like him, and then additional facts. Not necessarily the case with the Ruby sightings. The Ruby sightings are just Oswald, someone that says, hey, the guy looked like Oswald and he was with Ruby. It's just that there are 12 independent people who say this. Now, to be clear, 12 people do not corroborate the same incident, but there are 12 people that corroborate the general idea of Ruby with Oswald. So the only one that isn't that is Beverly Oliver says that she was introduced and he said his name was Lee Oswald. And then there's the telephone operator story from the motel near Atlanta. Larry Crayford, to me, he doesn't look very close to Oswald. I mean, they're both thin white guys. Their faces are pretty different. But point taken on the Ruby sightings, most of them, don't have independent corroborating Oswald facts like the other Oswald imposter sightings. Okay, so in total, there's 26 people who say they saw Oswald at a time when he was supposed to have been accounted for. Let's subtract the Ruby ones. So that leaves us with 14 independent cases. So I guess, Larry, my question to you, rather than zooming into these individual sightings, just wanted to get your opinion on, what do we make of Oswald constantly being impersonated? Is it that you think it's the same guy? You think people are just mistaken? Is it multiple people using Oswald's name? What are your general thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of instances where Oswald was impersonated. Now, it is true, Oswald is not that distinctive. As you just said, he's a young, fairly thin white guy, with relatively short brown hair. After the assassination, it's a known fact from many crimes that people are tempted to relate things that they've seen to whatever. Anyway, so I think a lot of it is misidentification. I think more important are those where someone did something intentional and used the name Oswald. Or said something, as you said, that linked them. And the interesting fact is we don't just have that in Dallas. We have that information coming out of Miami. I think one of the sins of the FBI is after the fact, when they were taking some flack from the Warren Commission, they were sent back to do re-interviews. And I write about this in Someone Have Talked. There were a number of instances of employment applications by someone actually using the Oswald name at different places on Main Street in Dallas, down in center downtown Dallas, that the FBI essentially scrubbed out of the records. They would go talk to somebody, and somebody's boss was like, we don't really want the FBI hanging around here, and they would maneuver it so that they managed to eliminate those from the record. But I think there are at least a couple of concrete cases of someone looking at Oswald. At the same time, Oswald was working at the School Book Depository, applying for jobs in downtown Dallas. And there's a real good reason for that if there's going to be a shooting in downtown Dallas, whether it's in the School Book Depository or not. Certainly, the rental car incident, still I find is striking. And it looks to me like that was an intentional plant.
You're talking about Bolton Ford?
Bolton Ford, correct.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
When Oswald's in the Soviet Union, yeah.
Yeah. To frame Oswald and connect him to. So the interesting thing is the real serious impersonations either connect Oswald to Russia or Cuba. They're not just somebody that looks like him. There's somebody that uses his name, and there's somebody that connects him to something. So do I think there were a handful of serious impersonations? Yeah. even the one at Odio's could have been an impersonation. I can't write it off.
Uh-huh.
But in that case, of course, they also used the name, connected him to Cuba, and
Right.
connected him to being like some kind of cowboy that could do anything.
Yeah, and then the FBI followed up after the Warren report was published, and they went back and re-interviewed everybody, and they were like, "My bad, never mind." So that was something.
The FBI closed in questioning is the real investigators use open in questions.
Mm-hmm.
FBI tend to use closed. It's like, did you see Oswald in the school book depository at exactly 12:30?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, no, I saw him 2 minutes earlier. Oh, sorry,
Sure.
doesn't count.
Right. Well, let me ask you this. So if we have, uh, you said a handful of impersonations. I mean, I've documented a lot of different anomalies, should we say, throughout the course of this episode. I also have a chapter I wrote in the Chokeholds book on impersonations, just kind of documenting them. Almost all of them are kind of what you say with the corroborating facts, but we don't need more than a handful. Once you get into two or three impersonations, now you're talking about there's something going on that is not consistent with lone gunman behavior. Would you agree?
I would absolutely agree. In fact, I think you only need a couple of them. The Parrot Jungle incident in Miami, where the guy's talking about, my friend Lee, who is an expert marksman and was in Russia and he's either in Mexico City or Dallas. I'm not sure where. You don't need more than that one. I mean,
Right.
when that one's corroborated by other people who heard the same thing, somebody is setting Oswald up. There's
The
just no
parrot
doubt
one.
about it.
What's funny is that maybe the only one I didn't cover. Tell me what it is again. The parrot one.
Yeah, in Miami, this is a few weeks before the assassination
Uh-huh.
at a local restaurant in Miami. This young Cuban who's recently arrived and it is actually, we now know after researching it, staying at Mike McClaney's estate. Mike's helping. He's come out of Cuba. He's hanging around Mike's estate, where some very interesting people are also hanging around. Um, is trying to chat up this waitress. So he's hitting on the waitress and he's trying to build himself up.
Mhm.
Talking about, I'm just out of Cuba. I hate Castro, and I'd kill the SOB because I'm an expert marksman, and so is my friend Lee. So is my friend Lee, and he goes into the rest of this narrative. And Lee, we're both great shooters, and he's been in Russia and he hates Castro, and he's now living somewhere down in Mexico or he's in Dallas. And the lady reports this to the FBI. And when the FBI investigate it, they confirm it because other people, employees around the counter where this guy's talking, heard it. And
Hmm.
Ruth talked about how strange this guy, not Ruth, sorry, uh, Lillian, I think it was.
Ruth.
Yeah, I
Oh,
know. We just talked about Ruth too much. I'm pretty sure
yeah.
nobody's chatting up Ruth in Miami. I'm pretty sure about
Right.
that. Anyway, so the FBI is having a real hard time with it. And as it ends up, the FBI closes the report, and the lady says the agent came back and essentially told her it would really be best for everybody concerned if she'd stop talking about it.
Wow.
And this is going to great detail in someone who, this is one of the key, it's one of the key reports because it gives you some insight into who this young man might have heard talking about Lee in, not just Lee in Mexico City and Dallas.
Wow.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's move on here. I've got a second rebuttal really fast. This is just about a citation. William says, quote, "Your citation for James Martin's story about the long distance call from the Atlanta area motel to Oswald and then to Ruby by the same person is not valid for the proposition that, quote, when Martin tried to tell this story to the Warren Commission, Earl Warren ordered it stricken from the record and the stenographic tape was destroyed on site." So thank you, William. You're correct that what I cited there was Martin's HSCA testimony. And that was really for the first half of the sentence. I needed a secondary cite for that second proposition. I found that in, hey, the book we were just talking about, Harvey and Lee, page 764. Now, typically when I'm finding it, looking at anything in that book, if there's not a site immediately, I can go to the archives at Baylor online and I can find it. I was not able to find this claim that basically Martin's Warren Commission testimony was, stricken from the record, and Earl Warren ordered the tape destroyed on site. I couldn't find that. So I would say you can put an asterisk next to that. It isn't on page 764 of Harvey and Lee. But yeah, that's a fair point. All right, let's move on. This is kind of the last thing here. And this is I just want to walk through the claims of foreknowledge. Okay, this will be fun. This is kind of just like a bonus, really. All right, because the case doesn't hinge on it. It's just sort of like, did somebody know in advance? If so, probably not a lone gunman, right? All right, there's the recent disclosure of the Cambridge, England phone call to a Cambridge, England newspaper that they should call the American embassy for big news, and that was 25 minutes before the assassination. It's just so vague. It's like the Mr. Hunt letter to me. But so I would say it's completely inconclusive and not helpful. But what do you have a comment on that?
I'm in the same place.
Okay.
I spent a lot of time on the Kirk Newton incident out of
Yeah.
Scotland. That one's much more interesting to me. Someone
Okay.
may have heard a conversation over a
Wow.
channel that they were monitoring related to drug activities. The interesting thing about that is, if we're just talking raw speculation, right? It would be fascinating if someone heard a random comment from somebody involved in drug smuggling that, oh, they're out to get JFK and they're going to get him in Texas. Interesting comment. I actually tried to interview that guy after the fact, and it was interesting. I called his wife. She said, well, he's probably not going to want to talk to you. Called again, got him, and he said, well, I've had 2 brain operations after all that, and I don't remember anything. I'm, yeah, okay. We're not going much of anywhere with this, but I thought that was interesting. I write a lot about it, and someone would talk, especially because of Rose Cheramie, who may have heard the same rumor within the same drug trafficking circles. It just
Interesting.
kind of fascinating.
So, okay, let's you brought up Christensen. Let's jump to him real quick. So he worked for the NSA in Kirk Newton, Scotland, and 15. You can correct me if I'm wrong, because it sounds like you know a lot more about this one than I do. 15 years after the assassination is the first time he brings this up, that he had foreknowledge and heard about, the assassination was coming, and he tried to do something. And he mentions that in a letter to his old colleague, Nicholas Stevenson. Stevenson basically confirms that everything in the letter is accurate and consistent with his understanding of how things were, except for the main claim, which is that, Christensen tried to warn people about the assassination. So, and he was an alcoholic, and to me, the point of him coming forward so late and just having no other, is there anything there? I mean,
no,
yeah.
There's not anything. Like many of these, you can verify the basic facts. Did he work in intercept? Yeah. What kind of intercept did he work in? It wasn't military, it was commercial intercept. Okay. And
Okay.
we even know, I researched what are the target list? What were they looking for? What kind of information? Who were they monitoring? Whatever. And as I said, you could say that he heard rumors and gossip. Whether he really tried to warn anybody, you can't verify that.
Right.
I think it is interesting, though. Clearly, he thought his friend was going to do that, because this is one of those reports that wasn't made to the public. He wasn't looking for, he didn't have a story to tell. He's trying to get more benefits, literally more benefits. And so he's making a legal case, and he's asking his friend to commit to a case that he's going to make to VA, right? That's a very personal thing. And why would he even write the letter if he didn't think his friend would back him up?
Sure. Yeah.
I find that interesting. Now, the fact that his friend chooses not to back him up all the way, right? A lot of people have made those decisions over the years. I'm not even talking about this. And clearly, after it becomes discussed, he doesn't want to talk about it either. As with me, I'm not going to make a case. He decides to back away from it, which, that tickles my radar. So I wish I could add something concrete to it.
Yeah.
I do think something happened. I'm inclined to think that he may have heard a chance remark. And whether he tried to report it, I believe he very well might have gossiped about it.
Uh-huh.
whether he tried to report it up the chain of command. Quite frankly, it's logical that his supervisor, who's probably a lieutenant, would have said, that's not what you're supposed to be doing. That's not your
Hmm.
job. It's not my job. We're not going to put that in the logbook. And I
Sure.
will tell you, having filled out military logbooks myself, you report on your date, you report on what you're supposed to be doing.
Right.
That sort of thing it makes people ask questions that you don't want to deal with.
Sure. All right, let's go to the next one. Joseph Milteer. This is probably the most famous one, I would say, and because we have an audio tape. And Milteer is this right-wing guy. He's buddies with the people that killed those girls in the Birmingham church. So that's not good. Um, and we have this tape that was recorded by Miami police informant. What's the guy's name? I forget the informant's name, but anyway,
Somerset?
yeah, Somerset. Basically, he says on tape, they're going to get Kennedy. He says that they're going to do it. He's going to be killed from an office building with a high-powered rifle, and then they're going to pick up someone right away just to throw the public off. This is on tape. It's pretty specific, and it's just a few weeks before, so I don't know where to go with it. But this not one that I would throw out. Your thoughts?
I think I can help you with that. Stu Wexler and I spent an immense
Yes,
amount of
wonderful.
time researching this on our books about the King assassination, researching Somerset, Milteer, everything else. The bottom line is, push to shove, Milteer was talking about something very real. There were teams that had been trained to kill JFK. The FBI knows about this, okay? We even found the FBI reports. These folks are being trained to kill not just JFK, but RFK and several other primarily Jewish financial leaders. This is part of a revolutionary ultra-right campaign. So Milteer is talking about something very real that the FBI is already concerned about. So what he's saying is real. And yet we can absolutely document other plots against JFK were going on at that point in time, which gets you into the only question is which one of them killed him. Unfortunately, that's sad. But one of the pieces of misinformation associated with the Milteer thing is that that was reported to the FBI and it was reported to the Secret Service. The strange thing, and this is just how the Secret Service operated at the time, during that conversation on that tape, Milteer talks about Washington, D.C. And Milteer had previously worked in Washington, D.C. So when the Secret Service got the lead about a threat against JFK, they forwarded it in their files to Washington, D.C. And when people do trips, they only look at the city they're doing a trip for. It's not in the Dallas trip, and it's not in the Miami trip. It's in the DC trip. So the FBI indeed did go back and question the people that Milteer named, but in their usual wonderful fashion, they go up, this is before the assassination, and go, we understand you guys might kill the president. Is that true? What do you imagine the people will say? No, that is not, so
Right.
they warn all these people off effectively. Long story, but the Milteer thing is not what it's often represented to be when you dig into it.
So, is it fair to summarize what your position on it is that he knew something was going to happen, but whether or not the thing he knew was going to happen is the thing that happened in reality is not clear.
Correct.
But it's
And
possible.
correct, but it is interesting that in San Antonio, there was a threat to the Secret Service that these people, this right-wing organization, the NSRP, National States Rights Party, was going to do something against JFK in San Antonio. It's kind of like they're out to get him. And that is on the record. That relates to the William Walther thing as well in New Orleans. The FBI and the Secret Service were both aware that there were plots going against JFK, that there were outstanding threats, I should say, maybe not plots. That might push it too far.
Let's go to on that topic. That's a nice little segue. Let's go on to William Walter. So William Walter, he's an FBI night clerk who says that he got a teletype that was warning against President Kennedy being assassinated in Dallas, and he gets this teletype on November 17th, just 5 days before the assassination. So the teletype went, according to Walter, it went to Memphis, Dallas, Mobile, and New Orleans. But the thing is, none of the other offices had ever heard of that teletype. The physical document itself didn't exist. And so the HSCA ultimately determined that Walter wasn't credible. And Walter also told Quigley before he went to go meet Oswald in jail that Oswald was an FBI informant. And so the idea is, well, we got to throw out Walter's statement on that too, because he's not credible on the foreknowledge thing. Um, you know, my take is either Walter's telling the truth, because I always have a trouble going, why would somebody make something up? There are always going to be crazy people that make things up. I agree. That's going to happen. But it's just like that can't be the answer for every single witness. I don't know. They made it up. But I don't know. It does seem weird that there's nobody else in any of the other offices, but maybe they all just knew to keep their mouth shut. I don't know what to make of the Walter thing. What about you?
They didn't, Walther was telling the truth. They not only did not know to keep their mouth shut, the FBI made them all sign affidavits that they would not talk about this.
Wow.
This is something we'll be exploring in great depth in the Oswald puzzle book related to his activities with the FBI in New Orleans. But to touch on 2 or 3 points there, we know that these threats were outstanding. We know from who the distribution was on what Walther claimed. And quite frankly, one of the reasons they dinged Walther was that he tried to create a mock-up. And then they started critiquing him on the mock-up of it's kind of like, no, I told you people I don't have it. This is just what I remember seeing on it. So that was bogus. Okay, but the fact is that threat would have had to come out of either most likely Miami or New Orleans itself to be copied to those offices. Those were where they routinely copied information to the sister offices, essentially. So the threat I think is quite credible, because we know that there were threats coming from 2 places. They were coming from the NSRP, as we just discussed, and they were also coming from within certain Cuban exile groups. The FBI was very concerned about that. They were very concerned enough to warn the Secret Service in Chicago, which is totally another story. But
Right.
so I think the threat, whether it was, specifically about what was going to happen in Dallas that did happen, or just part of this outstanding threat monitoring system is a question. Walthers is highly credible. Even he's highly credible for 3 different reasons. First, even the people that he cites as, well, these guys will verify it. One was at my wedding. He was my best man. When they go to interview him, he's scared to death. But then what we found was records that the FBI actually had all of these different agents sign off on the fact that, oh, I'm going to put my writings that I never saw this thing. Well, maybe they did never see this thing, but it depends on how you parse your question. Did you hear about this? No, that's not what I asked you to sign off on.
You're saying there's a document that specifically says that the FBI agents agreed to not talk about this incident?
Correct.
Wow.
Yeah.
Larry Hancock. Hey. That's amazing.
And we'll go further with that. We'll examine the reasons why there almost certainly was a subversive file on Oswald in the New Orleans office that was covered up. And the fact that we just got discussing is the fact that Oswald went to the FBI and provided them detailed information on what was supposedly a clandestine FPCC group in New Orleans that was operating undercover. They had to put that in a subversive file. It would have been totally insane if they didn't.
Right.
So
Yeah.
in any event, yes, I find Walters pretty credible.
doing their job, as you said earlier. Okay, good. Well, that's kind of you're breaking some news to my audience there, breaking some news to me. So it's good. All right, we have three more left. So here we go. Eugene B. Dinkin. So this one's kind of a fun one. He's a private in the army over in France, and he studies psychological sets, which is basically the macro picture of media, I guess, is my understanding of it. And it's, he's kind of getting at like people, there's like subliminal messaging type thing. And, he says it shows that there's going to be a military coup, maybe with like a right-wing element. And he's saying all this in advance. He then goes AWOL, goes to Luxembourg and tries to, talk to the U.S. embassy there and tell them about all this stuff. They don't want to hear what he has to say. He goes back to the base. They're like, hey, this is not cool. You're gonna, I forget what it was. He was gonna either, they're gonna give him a psych evaluation. And he left before they could give him a psych evaluation to go to Geneva. And that's where he starts to talk to all the people at the UN press room. And one of the people he talks to is a journalist named Alex Desfontaines, who said, quote, or who said that Dinkin told him, quote, they were plotting against President Kennedy and that something would happen in Texas. So that's pretty specific. And that's just a few weeks before. Dinkin then gets, he comes back to the base, and they basically diagnose him with schizophrenia, and he ends up going to Walter Reed, and eventually they let him out, and he kind of goes on with his life. My whole thing here is obviously the journalist saying that he said that. That's very interesting. And then people also want to add, America's Untold Stories talked about LBJ going over there. And that's true. LBJ did go to Luxembourg right after this incident. They were making the case that it's very connected, and that was the reason LBJ went there, which is related to my next rebuttal. When I covered this the first time through, I made clear that like this is the argument. I could not find anything to support that was the purpose of LBJ's trip, but he did in fact go there. So rebuttal number 3, this is the last rebuttal today, from Kate in Australia. Kate says, I found some photos online of LBJ in Luxembourg on November 4th. The photos would show LBJ accompanied by Lady Bird with the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, Pierre Werner, were taken during what was described as a state visit. State visits are planned well in advance. That doesn't preclude LBJ from being drawn into the Dinkin matter while he was there, but it does mean that it's unlikely that he suddenly jetted over to Luxembourg. I think this is a good point. And again, it is true LBJ was there, but that's a big leap just to jump to that conclusion. Back to Dinkin generally, like I find his statements, the fact that he did it in advance and it was kind of specific and it's documented by a credible source, that's intriguing to me. But the overall method of how he found it, I still can't grasp and doesn't make sense to me. So what's your thought on Dinkin?
Well, first of all, I may know Kate in Australia, so if it's the Kate I know, hi, Kate. As far as Dinkin is concerned, one of the real problems is much of what you related about Dinkin is not true in terms of what Dinkin's actual job was. Dinkin worked with a logistics support group in France, essentially a clerical type job. There's some argument as to whether or not about what his real job was, because when this first story came out, the story was from the conspiracy side that he was some kind of an intercept operator, and he had heard this by monitoring French military channels, especially the French military channels coming out of Algeria that had, long story short, nobody's ever been able to prove that. We have looked at his assignment records. Nothing shows beyond his basic logistics clerical role. Okay. So if he didn't hear it that way, he was definitely not an intelligence analyst. There's no way with his rank and location he was an analyst. And actually, his relatives said that he commonly told them that he was very interested in international politics, and he had the ability to read behind the newspapers. He monitored the newspapers daily, he read news magazines, and he felt that he had the ability to detect things that were going on by interpreting what was in the news. Not part of his military job, just he had convinced himself that he could do that. And I think the answer is that he had convinced himself that he could do that. And it was a serious psychological problem. And I wouldn't categorize him as not sincere. By the way, contacted his family, they thought he was quite sincere. But when they themselves asked him, how did you come up with this? He pointed them towards the newspapers and materials that he had collected and routinely read. So I think it's a serious story that got handled by a newspaper reporter who wanted to make something out of it. I don't think it's real.
So you don't think LBJ jetted over to Luxembourg to
I think if he wanted
Yeah.
Dinkin to shut up, there would have been ways to shut up.
Right.
Yeah, there would have
Yeah.
been options.
But that is quite a coincidence that this guy had that level of confidence and he like calls this shot, not really knowing it, and he ends up being accurate, true, if what the reporter said was true. So
But you know yourself, Matt, we can go back and find probably 2 or 3 dozen people who were talking about Kennedy being at risk and at danger, and so
right.
unfortunately, it just was not uncommon at that point in time. If you read the newspapers, I was there. I read the newspapers about how some people were talking about JFK. I would think it would. Let's talk about Dallas. There was a lot of newspaper coverage about Kennedy going to Texas. I mean, things were so bad in Dallas that the mayor of Dallas had gotten a special ordinance passed to allow people to intervene to protect the president. People in Dallas were warning people in DC. So this was not the fact that JFK was at risk going to Texas and to Dallas. It was actually news at the time.
Right. It's not like he was necessarily going out on a limb. He was going out on a limb by leaving his base, but it's not like I guess other people could have made similar claims. I got it. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I'm certainly not basing my views on the case on anything Dinkin said. All right, 2 more. These are probably the 2 most, well, other than Milteer, these are the two biggest foreknowledge ones, famous cases. Rose Cheramie. So I believe it's the introduction scene for Oliver Stone's JFK is Rose Cheramie. It's been a minute since I've seen the film, but basically the big picture story on Cheramie and the Warren Report critic world is that she's traveling with 2 Cuban exiles, and then she's abandoned by them after she gets into a fight with them at the Silver Slipper Lounge, and then she's hit by a car. They take her to the hospital. She's having heroin withdrawals, and eventually they take her to this East Louisiana State Mental Hospital. She's later says that the 2 men that were with her, I believe it was Frugier, went back and talked to the bartender, and he identified one of the men as Sergio Arcacha Smith and another one as I forget the name, but he like said it wrong, but it's Santana is what people say it is. But at any rate, when you zoom into the details of the story, by the way, there's the whole saga of Rose Cheramie and the drug deal that she calls in advance, and they bring in customs and they try to thwart it, and everything she says checks out, so that proves she's credible or whatever, according to Frugier. But the challenge is that really one of the main witnesses is Dr. Weiss. Dr. Weiss totally changes his story about Cheramie, even getting to the point of saying that he wasn't even didn't even know about her, or the first time he met her was like a few days after the assassination, and some other doctor, Dr. Bowers, is actually the one that treated her, and he relayed the story to Dr. Weiss. Dr. Bowers says that's not true at all. I never treated her. So that's a challenge. And then also you got the Frugier. There's a couple of Garrison memos related to Frugier, one that he writes, one that they're interviewing him, and he doesn't mention this Cheramie foreknowledge in those memos, which I thought that was kind of a fair point. Look, there's one other little. So to me, I went through all this and I said, I don't know if you can. I don't know if we can fully believe the Frugier Weiss story. But then I come back to, why would they make it up? Why would Weiss make it up? And then why would there's another doctor that's on the record, and then another law enforcement guy. But there's a few other people that are on the record. And then there's this whole story of the piece of the newspaper ad that's found in Pennsylvania where the Cuban doctor's burning the stuff, and it says Jack Ruby, Lee Oswald, Dallas, and then it says Silver Slipper. But okay, there's a lot of silver slippers. I thought that was weird because it's just a few days after. So for Cheramie, I kind of rated it as inconclusive, but I know I'm gonna get a lot of flack from that. But what are your thoughts, Larry?
Well, I would encourage anybody that's got someone would have talked in the third edition. I think I devote 4 or 5 pages to this research, Cheramie, in great detail. Uh, but to help, basically, there is no doubt about the fact that, yeah, Jack Ruby had owned a bar called the Silver Slipper at one time, way earlier. And if she was a stripper at one of Ruby's bars, it wasn't the Carousel. That was way earlier in time. What is missing out of all this, unfortunately, and it's not entered into the record for some reason, we actually brought a witness from Louisiana. I had a very good friend who dealt with this in Louisiana, the whole garrison thing, brought this lady to Dallas to speak at a Lancer conference. And the story that's never covered is Frugier did not transport Rose Cheramie by himself, just as that's illegal. She's a female prisoner. She's not in her right mind. She's having delusions. He caught a secretary to go with him when he was transporting her. We brought the secretary to Dallas, and she said absolutely the story that Frugier is telling is 100% true. And yes, Cheramie was talking about her concerns about Kennedy in Texas, that he was at risk. She heard that. She felt that the doctors had backed off because this is not good for their professional credentials. Even being talked to by the commissions and by law enforcement is not good for them. But she absolutely confirmed. She was very supportive of Frugier and said that what he had heard, and she had heard some of the same things.
Wow.
So I am convinced at this point in time, Cheramie simply heard a story that you would have heard if you would have been in the right places. Yeah, there's this drug network going from Miami to Dallas. Everybody knows that they're not happy with RFK. They're not happy with JFK. There were contracts out. Again, there was a standing threat. So, and she's from Dallas. Her child is in Dallas. Everything that was confirmed about her child being in Dallas has proven in. I mean, her child has even written a book. So as far as the basic facts, she's credible. Did she hear anything that really tells us about the actual attack in Dallas and who was behind it? I do not think so. But I think she was accurately reporting rumors and gossip that many people were aware of.
So credible, but not specific. That's a big fact about the secretary. I mean, that's huge. That would change my analysis.
And
I think.
we captured it on film. Nobody's ever put it into her book. I haven't put her into her book. And unfortunately, my friend who had located her and interviewed her died a couple of years afterwards. He never did anything with the story. So that's just been under the radar, really.
Well, I'm glad to bring it out on the radar a little more. And I mean, the whole thing of the Weiss and Frugier changing their statements. Diogenio says like they just wanted to distance themselves from it, and that's why they did it. They were lying because they didn't want to be involved.
Yep.
So this is also around the time of the HSCA.
Not the only ones.
Yeah, right. Okay, cool. Well, good. We got some resolution on that. This next one's maybe a little cloudier. Richard Case Nagell.
Yes.
Woo. Okay. I'm not good. This you could have a whole podcast just on Nagell, like a whole season. But just the big picture. This is the guy that he claims to be a triple agent. He's working for the U.S. intelligence, then the KGB, then he flips from the KGB to really work for the U.S. And the KGB tells him that they found out about Oswald, or found out about this plot, and that Oswald's going to be the shooter or the patsy, and that's not clear to me if Nagell's point is that Oswald's actually the killer, or if that Oswald's going to be the one who's framed, and they got to kill him either way to kind of stop it. But uh, anyway, he shoots at a wall in El Paso. He's arrested after that. There's no evidence that I could find showing Nagell predicting the JFK assassination beforehand. Like, there's no documents, there's no statements. His lawyer at the time says he didn't do it. There's also a lot of evidence that shows Nagell had serious mental problems. So you look at that and you go, let's toss this. It's nothing. And then you come to the hook of why you pay attention to Nagell, which is, we have the CIA memo to the FBI that says that Nagell had the names of 7 active assets in his notebook. And then, by the way, everything I'm saying right now, I'm citing to an article you wrote. Fun fact. Nagell also had the unlisted Cuban embassy phone number. And most importantly, he had Oswald's ID on him that said Alec Hidell when he was arrested. So if he's got Oswald's and a picture of Oswald, that's wild. Now, that whole thing, which is, to me, that's the big point. It's in the back of Russell's book. I don't know how authenticate. I don't know about like the chain of evidence. I haven't seen like an FBI report that says like, hey, here's this extra ID we found, but perhaps that wouldn't be there. And then to put a cherry on top of the Nagell story, the ARRB sends him a letter that they want to interview him, and the day after they sent the letter, Nagell died of a heart attack, which, natural causes. But then again, we learned during the church committee, they got the heart attack gun. So, but not all heart attacks are the heart attack gun, but maybe one of them is at some point in history. Why do you have a heart attack gun? Okay. I'm not saying that's the thing. I'm just throwing that out there. All right. And then, supposedly there's a purple trunk that Nagell told his son about. It was at a storage unit, and the son went to go visit the storage unit. The purple trunk's missing. And when he comes back home, his house had been ransacked through. And I talked to another guy, Richard Booth, just an investigator who reached out to investigate. He's a research guy, researches stuff. Oklahoma City is his big area of expertise. But anyway, he reached out to Nagell's son, Robert Nagell. And Robert told him that when he got back after the house was ransacked, and 2 people, a man and a woman, were there at his house from the State Department that said they wanted to talk to him about North Korean counterfeit bills, and went through the office. So I don't know, all that's crazy and interesting. And on one hand, you could say, well, look, he didn't actually say anything about the foreknowledge when he had it. He doesn't start talking about having foreknowledge until Kennedy's dead. But on the other hand, why does he have all these things that he shouldn't have? I can't figure it out. What do you say, Larry?
Oh, I've spent so much time with Nagell. I for years, I flew around the country with Dick Russell's book, taking notes on airline trips. And so, okay, cut to the chase. You mentioned his lawyer. An interesting fact is his lawyer said that he would have made a totally different defense of Nagell in court, not an insanity defense, if he had only been able to confirm that Nagell had actually been in contact with the CIA or had been in Mexico. We now know both of those things were absolutely true. Probably the most interesting thing that has emerged was that records proving that Nagell was in Mexico City, and Nagell actually went to the State Department in Mexico City and told them he was defecting and that he was going to be providing information to a foreign power. Most people aren't aware of that.
Wow.
And the other most interesting thing about that is nobody did anything about it. Like, okay, where's the FBI? Where's this guy does have military intelligence background, and he just went into the office and said he's going to defect to a foreign power and provide information.
Sounds familiar.
Something should have happened. There is a day job there. Something should have happened. Nothing happened. The interesting point in time is that we can prove now another part of Nagell's story, and that was that he was in contact with a CIA officer who he had known in Japan and who was actually in charge of CIA activities in Japan. We now know that Henry Heckscher, who was exactly that person, had been brought back during the Cuban Missile Crisis and detailed to do something in Mexico City that we don't understand and that there is no record of. We just located his trip records. I'm not sure that Kate wasn't the one that located some travel records that helped out on that. But so there are many pieces that corroborate Nagell's essential credibility on certain points. The fact that he would have been able to know that Oswald was in Japan at the same time the CIA officer was in charge, and that Nagell himself was there. That's pretty good corroboration that Nagell knows something. That brings us to the bad part of the story, and that is the fact that, as you said, there's not only no corroboration, but there's no way that Nagell could have known anything specific about the Dallas attack because he had already been in jail for some weeks because of the incident at the bank. The only thing Nagell can offer us that's of interest is the fact that he said he had been in Miami, which is provable. He had gone from Miami to New Orleans and on to El Paso, which is likely. There's no record of him in New Orleans, but that's the way you would get there. But he claimed to have seen Oswald meeting with Cubans in New Orleans who were fooling Oswald. Nagell knew from his observations in Miami that these were anti-Castro Cubans, yet they were representing themselves to Oswald as Cuban supporters, perhaps even Cuban intelligence agents. That's very interesting. The problem is, if I could put Nagell in New Orleans, I would put it in the book. We didn't put it in the book because we didn't do that. So I find it very indicative. We have lots of other corroboration that just such a meeting was going on in New Orleans, but Nagell's not part of the story. So we didn't put him in. But I do think that Nagell had valuable information on Oswald and that contact in New Orleans. And I think there were people that were very worried about it. Nagell claimed to have had a tape. He may have had a tape. But what Nagell didn't have was anything that's not a warning. You can't really warn anybody.
Right.
So there's nothing that happens before the attack in Dallas. And when he does, and I put together separately a huge research document on this, the only thing he tries to tell people after the fact, after the assassination, is that there were people that were manipulating Oswald. That's all he has to offer. But nobody wants to hear that. At that point in time, that indicates conspiracy. Oswald with others is the last thing in the world anybody wants to hear. Nagell is going to stay in jail. The interesting thing, I think one interesting thing is that we have a letter from the judge who essentially had charge of Nagell because he'd had it committed, basically saying, if you stop saying this, I'll release you right now.
Wow. Okay.
And no, he didn't, and no, he didn't get released. and later on, just as a factoid, Nagell said that he made an outreach to Garrison, and then he drew back and didn't make it because he was convinced that the guy that came to visit it had connections to the CIA. Well, son of a gun, yes, he did.
Yeah. Was that Felon or?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. So on the just one more question on Nagell, a follow-up, because I just talked to Dr. Newman, John Newman, last episode. I don't know if you've read Uncovering Popov's Mole or if you're familiar with the claims in that. But the idea is that there's this mole at the top of the CIA, and when you cross-reference that with what Nagell's saying, which is, hey, the KGB found out that there's this plot against Oswald, and it's going to involve, plot against Kennedy, and it's going to involve this guy Lee Harvey Oswald. It's plausible that the KGB, if there was something at the top of the CIA, the KGB did have a mole there. But that would just really be speculating because we don't have any proof that in fact that happened. I guess I'm just speaking to the possibility, but what's your thought?
The thing I could offer that is Nagell basically says, and this goes back to Russell's work with him, that when he was first contacted by the KGB in Mexico City, because they knew he had some anti-American sympathies, that, not happy with the CIA, that it wasn't, they were concerned about Cubans who might use Oswald, but they were also concerned about Oswald embarrassing them. That, because he had been in the Soviet Union, if somebody manipulated Oswald, it could point back to them.
Mhm.
So the first contact wasn't really about contact was, this is a guy who's connected us. We think you know him. Could you watch over him? And if it looks like somebody's trying to use him, kill him or whatever, do something, because it could really be an embarrassment to us, which obviously in the end it was.
Right.
But it wasn't, again, that the first contact was more like, Oswald represents an exposure to us. Could you kind of watch over what's going on with him?
Mhm. Yeah. Okay, good. Well, that's man, I learned a lot today. And it's good. You and I are pretty, let's say, generally aligned. I probably have a little bit more skepticism about the Paines, although after our talk today, I can't say that I'm that far off from where you are. And you've been doing this a lot longer than me, so I got to have a little bit of humility here. And
Been doing it a
it's
lot
not
longer
always.
than dirt, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm in this about 20 hours a week for the last 3 years. So this is my part-time job basically for another season of this podcast at least. But thanks so much for coming on. And yeah, I'll be down in Dallas. So maybe I'll do you live in Dallas?
No, I don't. I live in Oklahoma. This year I'm
Okay.
going to be I'll be doing the Lancer
Okay.
conference remotely, but be interested if you pick up the David Boylan and I are doing a presentation at Lancer called Oswald Games the FBI.
Okay. Cool.
And I think you'll find that interesting.
I'll try to swing by. I'm speaking at Kappa a couple times. I've weaseled my way into the game, Larry.
Ah,
But anyway, well, cool. I really appreciate your time and your research and scholarship over the years. And yeah, I look forward to talking to you again sometime.
I enjoyed it. Anytime, just give me a yell.
All right, cool. Thanks a lot, Larry.
You bet. Bye, man.
All right, bye bye.